What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Motorola Moto G Power 5G and the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about either phone individually, be sure to check out the description, where we'll be linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Moto G Power 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch 120Hz IPS LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 405, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. With the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G, we're getting a 6.4-inch 120Hz Super AMOLED display. This phone also has a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 403, and a 19.5:9 aspect ratio. So in general, both phones here have great displays, and no matter which one you get, whether you're doing stuff like reading, where you might want things to show up a bit larger and be easier to see, or maybe you're doing something like watching videos where you want really good image quality, regardless, either phone will be a great choice. That being said though, each phone does have an advantage over the other. On one hand, with the Moto G Power 5G at 6.5 inches versus 6.4 with the A54 5G, it is a tiny bit larger and you can kind of tell. So if you do want the larger display between the two, the Moto G Power 5G will have an advantage. On the other hand, with the A54 5G, again we are getting a Super AMOLED display which tends to have better looking colors. Things are a bit brighter and more vibrant, and the viewing angles are also significantly better. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, or really in any kind of bright area, the A54 5G is going to be easier to see. But aside from that, again, both phones do have really good displays in general, so if that is something you're looking for, you're definitely not going to go wrong with either phone here. Now for storage, with the Moto G Power 5G, we're getting 256GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and with the A54 5G, we're getting 128GB with microSD card expansion as well. Now, before we get into this, I do want to point out, on one hand, with the Moto G Power 5G, this is the factory unlocked version you get through Motorola, and when this phone eventually gets to US carriers, I seriously doubt it's going to have the full 256GB. So if you do want this much storage, you are going to have to get it factory unlocked. On the other hand, with the A54 5G, I believe there is another version of this phone that does have 256, but if you do get this phone through a US carrier, you are going to get 128. Now, in general, I feel like no matter what, once the Moto G Power 5G does actually get to carriers, the storage here is going to be equal. I'm pretty sure this phone is going to end up having 128. But as of right now, this phone in my hand does have 256, giving it quite an advantage. So if you do want more storage, if that's really something that's more important to you, then I would definitely go with the Moto G Power 5G. Because even if you do get this phone factory unlocked, it goes for around $199. Whereas with the A54 5G, factory unlocked at full price, this phone is around $449, so definitely quite a difference. But in general, I feel like for the average user, either phone is really going to have plenty of storage. I mean, 128GB is still perfectly fine for most people. But again, if you do want 256, at least if you get it factory unlocked, the Moto G Power 5G does have it. For security features, both phones have face unlock as well as fingerprint scanners. With the Moto G Power 5G, it's right here on the power key. And with the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G, it's right here in the display. But starting with the Moto G Power 5G, let's give them a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And now for the A54 5G. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive. No issues at all. And again, remember, both phones have face unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. For the camera setups, with the Moto G Power 5G, up front, we got a nice looking hole punch design for the selfie camera. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. For video, this phone has a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so unfortunately no 4K here, but considering this is more of an entry-level device anyway, I'm not really that surprised. With the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G, up front we have pretty much the same design for the selfie camera. This camera is 32 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 5 megapixel macro camera. And then for video, this phone can record in 4K in both the rear and front cameras. So if you are recording a lot of videos and maybe you want to get that higher resolution, then between the two, the A54 5G of course will have an advantage. Now as far as the other camera features go, they are pretty similar, but keep in mind again, the Moto G Power 5G unfortunately doesn't have an ultra-wide camera, which even though this phone is really only $199. I feel like this is kind of disappointing because at this point in 2023, an ultra-wide camera is such a popular and widely used feature. You would think pretty much every phone, especially a 5G phone like this, would have one now. But unfortunately, clearly that's not the case. So if you do want an ultra-wide camera, keep in mind, the A54 5G will have an advantage. And I also do want to point out that even though the Moto G Power 5G does have a depth sensing camera, and the A54 5G doesn't, really the only reason it doesn't have a depth sensing camera is because with the A54 5G, it really just doesn't need one. The hardware is just that good, so keep in mind, portrait mode still works perfectly fine. Now to give you an idea of what they can do, first, here's some pictures taken with the Moto G Power 5G. Overall, great quality here, and in general, I feel like for the average user, you're probably not really gonna need a whole lot better than this. If you're doing stuff like taking photos for Instagram, using Snapchat, sending photos to family and friends using something like Twitter, regardless, I feel like this phone is gonna get the job done perfectly fine for pretty much anything. Sure, if you're serious about mobile photography and you're constantly taking pictures, maybe you wanna spend a little bit more and get something higher end in that situation. But honestly, for casual daily use, you really don't need to spend $1,000 on a flagship phone or anything like that, because as you can probably see here, a phone like the Moto G Power 5G is going to get the job done just fine in most situations. And then here's some pictures taken with the A54 5G, and overall pretty much the same kind of thing. I feel like the quality between the two is more or less roughly equal, but if you look really closely, the A54 5G has a slight advantage just because the colors look a little bit better. Things seem to be more alive in these photos, whereas with the Moto G Power 5G, everything does look really good for the most part, but the colors aren't quite as sharp and strong. That being said though, it's more or less a preference kind of thing because some people might like things a bit less saturated, in which case the Moto G Power 5G might actually be better. But overall, when it comes to pure photo quality, I feel like they're roughly the same. But of course, if you want to record 4K videos and maybe you want an ultra-wide camera, then in that case, the A54 5G will definitely have an advantage. But otherwise, the Moto G Power 5G is still perfectly fine. And for the average user, you're really not going to go wrong with either camera here. When it comes to RAM and processor, with the Moto G Power 5G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 930 processor. With the A54 5G, we're also getting 6GB of RAM here with the Exynos 1380 processor. Now overall, both phones have really good performance, and for more typical daily tasks like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and maybe some light mobile gaming, either phone will be perfectly fine. But between the two, the A54 5G is, while maybe not that much faster, definitely still going to have a noticeable advantage when it comes to performance. So if you do want the faster phone between the two, then I would go with the A54 5G. But on the other hand, the Moto G Power 5G is definitely not slow by any means. And again, for the average user, it will get the job done just fine. Now I did run a benchmark test on each phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So again, as you can see here, between the two, the A54 5G has a bit of an advantage, and again, in my experience, this phone is a tiny bit faster, but keep in mind the difference is really not that huge. So on one hand, if you're going to be on your phone a bit more and you just want slightly nicer, smoother performance, then yeah, you might want to go with the A54 5G, but if you're really just going to be using your phone casually for more basic activities anyway, in that case, you're probably not going to see a huge difference. Now both phones have 5000 mAh batteries, with the Moto G Power 5G supporting 15W fast charging, and the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G supporting 25. So between the two, on one hand, the charging speed is a little bit different, with the A54 5G obviously having an advantage, but keep in mind if you don't have a 25W fast charger, you're really not going to see any difference there. So as far as that goes, just know, if you really want to maximize your phone's fast charging, then you will want to go with the A54 5G and make sure you have a 25W charger, but otherwise, the charging speed with the Moto G Power 5G is honestly perfectly fine too. Aside from that, with 5000 mAh batteries, you can expect to get great battery life and longevity with either phone here. So between the two, if the battery is more of a priority for you, then you're really not going to go wrong either way. For the software, both phones do have Android 13, but I would personally trust Samsung's software support a bit more. I know for a fact this phone will be getting Android 14, 15, 16, and 17, whereas with the Moto G Power 5G, I feel like this phone does have at least a couple years of software support, if not the same as Samsung, but I'm not 100% sure. And plus, the last generation of Motorola phones has been kind of slow to update, whereas with the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G, or really the last generation for that matter, like the A53 5G, A23 5G, and so on, those phones all got Android 13 in December. So really, if stuff like updates and software support is important to you, I would go with the A54 5G. But if you just want the latest version of Android right now, and maybe you don't typically keep the same phone for more than like a year, in that case, either phone will be perfectly fine. As far as other features go, on one hand, with the A54 5G, unfortunately this phone does not have a headphone jack, whereas the Moto G Power 5G actually does. So keep in mind, if you have a normal pair of 3.5mm headphones, you can use them with the Moto G Power 5G no problem, but with the A54 5G, you will need an adapter, which is kinda inconvenient. On the other hand though, the A54 5G does have NFC, whereas for whatever reason, the Moto G Power 5G doesn't. So if you like to use tap and pay, then you will want to go with the A54 5G. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? Now, in general, on paper, if we're just looking at the specs and nothing else, I would say the A54 5G is the better device here. Despite both phones having really nice displays, the AMOLED display definitely gives the A54 5G an edge. Both phones again have really good photo quality, but again, the A54 5G does have an ultra-wide camera, and it can also record 4K videos. This phone is also a bit faster, has slightly better fast charging, better software support, and again, it does have NFC, which, although some people who don't use tap and pay probably won't care about this, I feel like not having NFC is, at this point in 2023, kind of a deal breaker. So yeah, in general, while the Moto G Power 5G is really not far behind, I would say technically the A54 5G is the better device here. But with that being said, when you really think about the actual value you're getting for the money, again at full price, the Moto G Power 5G is not even fully $200, whereas with the A54 5G, again full price factory unlocked, this phone is going for $449, so over double the price. Now of course, if you're in the US getting one of these phones from a US carrier, it's seriously unlikely you're actually going to pay full price for either of them, but at the same time the fact remains, the Moto G Power 5G is typically going to be quite a bit more affordable, and while again, it does make sense since after all, the A54 5G is a bit more premium and just has some nicer features in general. Overall, I feel like the difference is definitely not worth a couple $100s. So if you really want to record 4K videos and maybe you want an ultra-wide camera, or you really like to use tap and pay, then yeah, the A54 5G might actually be worth it. But if you're really just looking for an entry-level 5G phone for more basic activities, you want a nice camera, a nice display, a bunch of storage, a large battery, and pretty good performance, but you don't really need a bunch of bells and whistles or anything, then honestly, for the money, I do think the Moto G Power 5G is actually a better choice here. But this concludes my comparison between the Motorola Moto G Power 5G and the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.